18 Monaten inzwischen. Eine Brise von Internationalität, internationaler Wissenschaft. Alle 3 bis 4 Wochen gibt es ein neues Bild von einem internationalen Gast auf der Homepage. Und es sind inzwischen etwa 30 Kolleginnen und Kollegen aus etwa 15 Ländern, die meisten aus den USA, aber auch aus den Nachbarländern, Niederlande, Belgien, Dänemark, aber auch aus Südafrika oder Australien sind Gäste dabei gewesen. Und das ist eine hervorragende Sache, aus Sicht jedenfalls des kollegialen Dekanats, weil die Studierenden in Kontakt kommen mit internationalen Wissenschaftsdiskursen, für die Lehrenden Kontakte entstehen, auch Netzwerkbildungen, die genutzt werden können für gemeinsame Vorhaben. Jetzt sind die Studierenden des Masterstudiengangs Religion im kulturellen Kontext wirklich in einer besonderen Situation, das können wir wirklich schätzen, weil Religionswissenschaftler und ein bisschen auch Theologen scheinen da besonders begabt zu sein, internationale Kontakte zu nutzen und auch erfolgreiche Anträge zu schreiben. Denn man muss feststellen, dass bislang, also bis heute, kein anderes Institut an der Fakultät so viele Visiting Scholars begrüßen konnte wie das Institut für Theologie und Religionswissenschaften. Wir sind da ganz vorne ab und ich habe schon in die Richtung geguckt. Ich denke, an dieser Stelle sollten wir mal den Ansitz besonders danken. Und es gibt auch noch ein paar andere aktive Leute, die sich um diese internationalen Beziehungen kümmern, auch denen vielen Dank. Und dann gibt es noch einen zweiten Rekord sozusagen. Dieses Institut hat sich dadurch hervorgetan, dass es mehr als andere es geschafft haben, internationale Gäste mit Rang und Namen hierher zu holen. Und was wir heute Abend erleben, ist, glaube ich, so etwas wie ein Highlight in dieser Entwicklung. Und jetzt komme ich auf unseren Gast. Für mich ist es eine besondere Freude und auch im Namen der gesamten Fakultätsleitung Sie herzlich begrüßen zu dürfen, Herr Casanova, für den Vortrag heute Abend und dann auch für den Workshop, der sich anschließt. Leute, die Ihre Bücher lesen, merken, glaube ich, ziemlich schnell, dass es sich gar nicht um eine Marketingphrase handelt, um Floskeln, die so von Verlagen ja häufig benutzt werden, um ein Buch am Markt zu platzieren, wenn die Rede davon ist, dass Herr Casanova zu den bedeutendsten Religionssoziologen der Gegenwart gehört und das auch auf einer internationalen Ebene international entsprechend bekannt ist. Die globale Perspektive, die er einnimmt, ist, glaube ich, besonders geeignet, um Vertrautheiten, Selbstverständlichkeiten, die ungefragt übernommen werden, aufzustöbern und neue Forschungsfragen zu generieren und zu evozieren auch. Also etwa ein solcher Satz, über den wir vielleicht noch sprechen werden, der es in sich hat, wenn es heißt, nicht die Religionen sind ein Problem für Europa, sondern die Annahme, dass ausschließlich säkularisierte Gesellschaften, säkulare Gesellschaften, demokratische Gesellschaften sein können. Davon würden wir gerne mehr hören, von solchen Thesen. Und deshalb vielen Dank, dass Sie zu uns gekommen sind nach Hannover. Ich glaube, Herr Antes könnte noch ein paar Worte sagen zum Werk und zum Ansatz von Herrn Casanova und dann geben wir Ihnen das Wort. Vielen Dank.
Der Dekan hat bereits darauf hingewiesen, dass wir in diesem Antragsprogramm besonders erfolgreich waren und ich möchte unterstreichen, ohne die massive Unterstützung durch Herrn Fürding wäre das nicht gelungen. Die Kontakte habe ich zwar zum Teil leicht herstellen können, aber wie ich so gerne sage, die Antragslyrik, die ist mir nicht ganz so vertraut, wie das erforderlich ist, um erfolgreich Anträge auch zum Ende und zur Krönung zu bringen. Es ist uns unter all diesen Anträgen aber eine besondere Freude, heute José Casanova hier zu begrüßen. Der Dekan hat schon darauf hingewiesen, dass es in vielen Publikationen, nicht zuletzt auch in dem Büchlein, das in Englisch, wenn ich das richtig weiß, noch nicht als Buch vorliegt, Europas Angst vor der Religion, geschafft haben, sozusagen vertraute Debatten völlig umzukehren und Dinge, die uns geradezu selbstverständlich sind, wieder zu hinterfragen und zu sagen, schau doch mal hin, ob das alles so stimmt, ob zum Beispiel tatsächlich der säkulare Staat ein Ergebnis der Religionskämpfe ist oder ob die Integration von Muslimen richtig gedeutet wird, wie sie im Allgemeinen bei uns diskutiert wird und vieles andere mehr. Insofern haben wir also die große Freude, auf vieles immer wieder in den Seminaren und auch in den Vorträgen zu sprechen zu kommen, was aus Ihrer Feder stammt, und freuen uns ganz besonders, Sie nun auch live hier zu erleben. Sie haben zwar darum gebeten, den Vortrag auf Englisch zu halten, aber bei der Diskussion dürfen auch Fragen auf Deutsch gestellt werden, und insofern wird also die Kommunikation dadurch wesentlich erleichtert, glaube ich. Ich will auch nicht zu lange die Einleitung machen, weil ich natürlich Ihnen die Zeit nicht wegnehmen möchte, und ich freue, dass Sie überhaupt in diesen öffentlichen Vortrag gegangen sind, da die Teilnehmenden hier unterschiedliche Informationen haben, worüber sie reden werden, möchte ich Sie bitten, dann auch zu Beginn das Thema nochmal so zu formulieren, wie Sie es jetzt uns präsentieren werden. Die, die den Aushang gelesen haben, haben es zwar schon gesehen, wer aber die einzelnen Hefte in der Hand gehalten hat und sowohl beim Master als auch beim Bachelorstudiengang geguckt hat, wie das Thema lautet, wird schon auf zwei verschiedene Themen gestoßen sein, und ich kann Sie trösten, keines davon wird heute behandelt. Wir werden also jetzt gleich hören, was das Thema ist und dessen Inhalt. Und darauf freuen wir uns sehr und danken Ihnen für die Bereitschaft zu kommen.
Vielen Dank für beide nette Einleitungen. Es ist für mich eine große Freude und eine große Ehre, auf diesem Programm von Visiting Scholars teilzunehmen, eingeladen zu sein und diesen Vortrag halten zu dürfen. Jetzt muss ich auf Englisch. I understand there is some confusion about the topic of my lecture, but don't worry, I always have the same lecture, only the title changes. The title of my lecture is Civic Convivencia, Religious, Cultural, and Ethical Diversity in Post-Secular Societies. And the post-secular part is part of a conversation, a friendly discussion I've been having lately with Habermas over the concept of the post-secular society. There is a new book coming out. It will be out in the fall, hopefully before the end of the year, Habermas and Religion, edited by Craig Calhoun and Eduardo Mendieta and Jonathan van Antwerpen, and published by Polity Press. There is a paper I've written on exploring the post-secular, three meanings of the secular and their possible transcendence. So I'm not going to discuss these issues so much today because it will take us a whole lecture. And I had thought of developing this other argument about civic convivencia as a possible model to reflect upon. I would like to proceed in 3 steps. First, I will describe briefly the model of convivencia, namely the convivencia between the 3 Abrahamic religions, Christians, Muslims, and Jews in medieval Spain, in Christian Hispania, in Muslim Al-Andalus, and in Jewish Sephar. For all 3 religions, this concept was, of course, central to their imagination of which kind of society they should have, and has remained so for Jews till today and for Muslims till today. Then I will sketch schematically the model of homogeneous, confessional, nation-states societies that supplanted it and that has been a dominant model for European societies until very recently. And then I will try to offer some, to sketch some observations, some of them speculative, and you could say normative observations, but also some descriptive, attempt to describe the new trends, the future trends, if you wish, not futurology, but at least a sense of the direction in which we are heading, the new patterns of increasing religious, cultural, and ethical diversity, which are more and more characteristic of our, what I call post-national, post-secular societies, and as we are all entering this global age. And it is for this that we need not simply to go back to the model of convivencia, which is a medieval model that is not really translatable for modern democratic societies, but nonetheless, maybe to have at least some ideas of the possibility of rethinking the living together of religious and secular, and of the very different types of religious people. Now, the Spanish concept or word convivencia literally means simply living together. And in this respect, it is even in the, it denotes not only peaceful coexistence, but actually amicably living together and sharing living experiences. This is what convivir means. It's not only vivir close to one another, but actually have common living experiences. And it has been used to characterize, of course, it was the name given then to the experience of Jews, Christians, and Muslims living together both under Muslim rulers, Cordoba being the model, and under Christian rulers in Toledo particularly. And it is the fact that it was a model that was in some variations, but shared by both Muslim kingdoms and Christian kingdoms where the 3 religions were living together, that is particularly of relevance for us. Of course, this was a brief period, roughly between the 11th and the 13th century, in between what was, of course, a period of rather crusading conflict between the religions, the Reconquista of Spain, following the previous Islamization of Spain, and of course what will be followed, the process of ethno-religious cleansing, the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain, to precisely construct a model of a Catholic kingdom, the Catholic kings, and the model of the first modern European confessional state that later will be reproduced through the Westphalian system across Europe. Of course, we should not idealize this model. It was a medieval model. It was not based on principles of individual human rights. It was also not based on principles of liberty, equality, and pursuit of happiness as self-evident truths. But nonetheless, it was a model of peaceful coexistence and of mutual interaction and of learning from one another. And it had both the levels of elites, exchanging text, translating each other key text, and discussing together key issues, and also, of course, the model of people living together, ordinary life, interacting together, and having even a division of labor. Jews being doctors and engineers, whatever, Muslims being there. So there was a kind of functional integration of the society in which all these three groups play particular parts in those societies. Of course, in the one case under Christian rulership, in the other under Muslim rulership. So it was not a principle of equality of religions, but rather a principle of rulers that understand their task of having toleration towards their plural religious subjects, rather than the notion that the ruler should impose his religion, cuius regio eius religio. On the contrary, the ruler was supposed to be a secular ruler, tolerating and, in a sense, respecting all the religions. Of course, this is a model that has not been unique to Spain. It was a model relatively common in imperial systems. Certainly, the Buddhist king Asoka, in a certain sense, was a model of this type of ruler, who himself being a religious ruler from one religion, nonetheless incorporates toleration of all religions in his realm. Of course, the Akbar, the Muslim Mughal emperor, had a similar model. To a certain extent, the Ottoman Empire was based on such a model. But it was interesting precisely because it is the three religions that had been for centuries in conflict with one another, and as we know today in the Middle East, still find difficulties to even peacefully coexist, not only to living together in convivencia, that in a certain sense has reawakened this model as a possible, at least, thought for us to rethink our relations. So I don't want to say more. There is a lot has been written on it, and obviously I'm no expert on it, so I only want to point out the kind of appeal, certain normative validity of the model despite its shortcomings, and it cannot be simply translated as a model to the contemporary modern democratic individualist societies. But it's interesting that the fact that there was the phenomenon of conversion to each other religions was so common then in Spain, was an indication that those were simply not three plural societies living, coexisting with one another without much interaction. But there was actually the possibility both of interacting, but even of converting and joining. Indeed, it was precisely because Jewish conversion to Christianity was so successful that it is the very success of the conversion that created the problem of anti-Semitism. Not unlike in Germany, it was because Jews could pass so much as Germans that the issue of the integration of Jews into Germany became much more problematic. So in this respect, it was the problem of the conversos. What made the problem really, really serious and critical, it was the fact that there were so many conversos. And how could you distinguish the true Christians, the old Christians, from the new Christians? And this is, in a certain sense, a problematic that will repeat itself, of course, in Nazi Germany. Now, other indication, of course, is at the level of the elites. Think of somebody like Averroes, Ibn Rasen, the great Muslim theologian, philosopher, born in Cordoba, the years 1126 to 1198, and of course the great Aristotelian philosopher, who will be a great influence on Thomas Aquinas. But also Maimonides, also born in Cordoba, just 9 years later. And therefore, the two great Aristotelian rationalist philosophers and theologians that play a crucial role in the Roman incorporation of Greco-Roman text, philosophy, tradition into Western philosophy and theology. Precisely, Thomas Aquinas will be probably unthinkable without Maimonides and Averroes. And so you have here two Cordovans that play a crucial role in this exchange, but also simultaneously the School of Translation in Toledo, whereby there is a systematic attempt not only to translate this Greek-Roman text from Arabic and Hebrew into Latin, but to translate Muslim text and Hebrew text, philosophy and theology, into Latin and vice versa. The translation of the Quran into Latin and of the Bible into Arabic and so on. So it is this process of translation that indicates precisely the way in which those cultures were really truly interacting, both at the elite level and the ordinary level. Now, as I mentioned, this model was tragically ended by the renewed Reconquista, and especially by the establishment of the new kingdom, the Catholic kings. We tend to forget that the Holy Inquisition had not entered Spain for 2 centuries. The Kingdom of Aragon had not allowed the Inquisition to come to Spain. We associate Spain with the Inquisition, but the Inquisition had been around as a court, or as a court of the church for several centuries, before actually it was introduced by the Catholic kings, not as a church court, but as a state court. It was to precisely help the process of state making and of precisely homogenization of the Spanish state, making it a Catholic state, that the Holy Inquisition was introduced in Spain in the late 15th century. And it is this process of confessionalization that required, of course, the first kings in Spain to call themselves Catholic kings. It is this official title that now forces the official confessionalization of their subjects, and what means that every subject has to be either Catholic or out of the kingdom. So the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain in 1492, after probably 8 centuries of Muslim presence, and perhaps even 15 centuries of Jewish presence. Obviously, Jews were in Europe before Christians were in Europe. So obviously, for 20 centuries, we have not recognized Jews as Europeans, somehow as if they do not belong here, although they were here before the Christians were in Europe. So, but this is part of the way we have constructed the image of a Christian Europe or of a Catholic nation. So the idea is that the ethno-religious cleansing that was so obvious and so massive in the case of Spain, and that so dramatically transformed Spanish society, of course became a model for every European state. Following the Peace of Westphalia and the principle cuius regio eius religio, there was some kind of ethno-religious cleansing and forced confessionalization everywhere. This is the only way in which all of Northern Europe could become homogeneously Protestant, all of Southern Europe homogeneously Catholic, and in between the 3 biconfessional societies, Holland, Germany, and Switzerland. Because here, the cause of ethno-religious cleansing could have been so stark that you could not have homogeneous national state churches, and therefore there has to be some kind of living, coexisting through, but not really through convivencia. It was either through the pillarization model in Holland or through the cantonalization model in Switzerland. Of course, Germany went through its own process of confessionalization in the different kingdoms and princely states. And as you know, there's a whole debate about the reconfessionalization of German society in the 19th century as modern politics developed. So this is not usually, we understand the formation of the modern state as being precisely a secular state that comes out of the process of learning from the religious wars. This is the way in which we ourselves, Europeans, tell the myth of the secular state. How once upon a time, we were also religious, and therefore fanatic, and therefore we kill each other because of religion. But fortunately, we learn from these terrible catastrophes, and we learn to establish secular states. But of course, this is the Enlightenment theory of the 18th century, has very little to do with the facts. The fact is that out of the religious wars did not come the secular state, but came the confessional state everywhere. Every European state became a confessional state, enforcing confessionalization, with the exception of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. These were the religious minorities had to flee. Before they escaped to the New World, to the United States. That's why all the Jews of Europe ended in Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine, because they were thrown out of the rest of Europe. And that's how all the Protestant radical sects, Unitarians and Moravian Brethren and Anabaptists, ended in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth before they moved on to the United States. So again, this is a story that we rarely tell, because we want to blame religion for it. If we call the wars not the wars of religion, but the wars of a state formation, we may look at the world differently. And so when we see conflicts around the world, we perhaps would not attribute these conflicts to religion, that religion is the problem. Because whenever the model of nation-state building was transferred from Europe to the rest of the world, they repeated the same story all over again. When the Ottoman Empire was dismantled and they developed nation-states, they went through the same process of ethno-religious cleansing in Turkey, in Greece, all over the Middle East. When the South Asia went through the process of nation-state formation, post-colonial, they went through the same ethno-religious cleansing. But I think that we should be careful not to blame religion for it, because religion had not been a problem through many centuries. Those religions everywhere were able to live together for many centuries without fighting with one another. So perhaps we should look at these processes not through our secular eyes, that it is religion because religion is intolerant and because religion creates conflict, a belief which we Europeans share. The majority of Europeans in every European society shares the belief that religion is intolerant and religion creates conflict. Particularly the second point, to me, is interesting because the history of the 20th century, European short history, from 1914 to 1989, was surely the bloodiest, most genocidal, most catastrophic century in the history of humanity. But none of these conflicts had anything to do with religion. Yet today, when we see conflicts around the world, we don't see the similarities with the conflicts we had in Europe in the 20th century, but we remember the religious wars of the 16th century, as if this could be the explanation for the conflicts that we see around the world. So I think that rewriting the history of Europe and seeing the beginning of the modern European state with the Catholic kings and the mother of the confessional state is really the formation of modern states in Europe that later will be the process of, precisely the process of secularization. Later in Europe takes the form, the particular form of deconfessionalization, because there was first a process of confessionalization. So secularization in Europe means primarily deconfessionalization, first of the state, then of the nation, and then of individuals and peoples. The model, interestingly enough, the principle cuius regio eius religio, basically didn't change with the transfer of sovereignty from royal sovereign to the popular or national sovereign. If you look at any abolition, let's say, French Revolution, you really don't see any expansion and all the process thereafter of religious pluralism. What you see is deconfessionalization, certainly, but not increase of any form of pluralism. And the same goes with, if you wish, radical democratization. In this respect, all European societies are extremely homogeneous religiously. The only move, there is no conversion from one religion to another or actually there is never conversion to religion. The only move there is away from religion, namely deconfessionalization, because people want to have individual freedom, of course, and they don't want to have a religion that was forced upon them. But the problem here is not religion per se, but it was a religion that was confessional religion. In America, it's very clear. In America, they associate religion with freedom because they were not Christians before independence, and they became Christians after independence, along with process of mobilization, democratization. So they associate religion with democratization, with political mobilization, with freedom, not as we do in Europe, with unfreedom, with the absolutist state, and so on. Of course, I'm simplifying the story, but as Professor Antes mentioned, I like to be a little polemic sometimes, and at least rouse the public a little, so that we can have some debate and discussion. It's very clear that this model cannot work anymore. Our societies, whether we want it or not, have become plural. The question is they can also become pluralistic. They are de facto plural, but we are still in the process of accepting pluralism. It began, as we know, through Gastarbeiter. They had to come here to Germany. I was a student in Innsbruck from 1969 to 1973, and I came by train every time full of Spanish Gastarbeiter. And I know how they were treated when they crossed the border into Switzerland and Germany. I actually entered first Austria as an illegal immigrant. They threw me out of the train, and a friend from Liechtenstein had to take me by car at night to Austria, where I took the train to continue on to Innsbruck, precisely because I had no visa, and I didn't know any German. So my friend, who was actually a student in Innsbruck and knew German, tried to convince the Polizei that I was a student. I said, well, of course you are, Raus, of course you are not a student. Anyhow, I was a Gastarbeiter. So, but of course, Gastarbeiters, I used to work in der Pfalz as a Gastarbeiter, mit Gastarbeitern, mit Türken, Spaniard, Griechen. And there were no Muslims then. There were only Türken in Deutschland. Now there are no Turks, there are only Muslims. How people have become from Turks to Muslims in both ways. They view themselves as Muslims more than as Turks, and vice versa. This is an interesting aspect of this process. I don't have the opportunity to go into analysis of why this happened, because it's a process of increasing what I call global denominationalism, or the portraying of religious identities as being central and frequently more important than national identities, which of course is not the way modernization was supposed to happen or secularization was supposed to happen, but it is a global fact around the world. I've been studying comparative immigration in South Africa, in Malaysia, in different places, and this process of kind of purification of religious identities, where people somehow associate their imagined community is the global Ummah, not their neighbors, but the global Ummah. So the global Muslim Ummah, the global Hindu Ummah. You have Muslims and Hindus that were brought to South Africa or to Trinidad and Guyana or to Malaysia by the British Empire. And they lived together as colored people, together the same trade unions, the same political parties. Certainly they were put together as colored people by the apartheid system in South Africa. But now you have a clear purification. Both identities, Hindus and Muslims, do not have any more relations with one another, but actually have become purified, and they have only relation now with their fellow Muslims around the world and with their fellow Hindus around the world. This is a problem. This is a problem, but it points not that, if you wish, traditional religion is the problem, because traditional religion was not a problem. Hindus and Muslims had no problem living together for centuries. Of course, there were problems. There are problems everywhere, but certainly not massacres, and certainly not radical separation of the ways. And so the point I'm making is that we must be a little more careful when we attribute those things to traditional religion, rather than being precisely processes of, we could call it, modernization and globalization. Now, the point, we know that, of course, nobody expected the Gastarbeiter to stay forever. Nobody likes guests to stay forever. So if you are a guest, you're supposed to leave on time. But, of course, they didn't. They didn't, and they brought their families and so on, and now we have second, third generation immigrants in societies that were not supposed to have immigrants. So our mental structure is not ready for it. But it's not only immigration of Gastarbeiters. It is the very process of European Union that has complicated matters, because each European nation state had created its own particular model of cuius regio eius religio. But they have different models. The Dutch was very different from the French, from the German, from the Italian, from the Scandinavian, etc. But now, none of them individually can serve as the model for all of Europe. So you have the tension precisely within Europe. On the one hand, a clause of the Constitution that says matters of church and state should be left to each sovereign state. Brussels should not interfere with these matters. But then comes, of course, the Court of Human Rights and has to interfere, you know, the crucifix in Italy. But again, usually Brussels, when it comes to the big states, still doesn't want to interfere too much into them. So don't worry, laïcité will not be challenged by the European courts, or for that matter, German policy will not be challenged by the European court. But there is this indication of the tension between precisely attempts to develop general principles and the particularities of integration, the way in which each country is following its own model of integration of immigrants. There was a time when we assumed, and even our political theories, even if you look at Habermas, at Rawls, the assumption of these modern democratic societies being on this liberal, secular, rational public sphere in which there is no room for religion. Now, it is the fact that Habermas, the great theorist of secular modernity, his whole work is based on a theory of secular modernization, whether it is the Strukturwandel der Öffentlichkeit, whether it is Theorie des kommunikativen Handels. Basically, his whole theory is based on some model of stages of development, rationalization, away from religion, and some secularization. The fact that he is the one that began to develop the concept of religion in the public sphere. The Öffentlichkeit for Habermas was supposed to be a secular Öffentlichkeit. The fact that he now recognizes that religion can have a role in the public sphere, and the fact that he's now the first one to introduce the concept of post-secular societies in Germany indicates the extent to which something is happening. Let me give you another illustration of something which is indicative of what is happening. I'm sure you know the story of the Max Planck Institute für Geschichte in Göttingen. Of course, this was the Institute of National German History, right? This has been one of the most prominent Max Planck Institutes in the Geisteswissenschaften. But of course, they realized that you could not do simply national history anymore. You had the new, really, really interesting, relevant history was world history, global history. You could not simply go on thinking that history could be divided up into national histories. So they proposed to the German historians to develop some project to develop the institute into Institut für Weltgeschichte. And somehow the German historians couldn't get their act together. And today, the institute is the Max Planck Institute for Ethno-Religious Diverse Societies. It is somewhat a paradox, but it is indicative precisely of this process I'm talking now, of the trend, the direction in which we are heading. We may try, of course, to create a fortress Europe, but it's very difficult because the borders of Europe are very difficult to define. Once you define Europe by its values, European values, and by its democratic system and its liberal market capitalism, then anybody who follows these values becomes European. And therefore, who belongs and who doesn't belong is very difficult. You have here the problem of Turkey. Does Turkey belong in Europe or not? Well, it depends. If Europe is supposed to be secular, then obviously it could belong before when it was secular but not democratic. If Europe is supposed to be democratic and follow basically the norms of a democratic societies and rule of law and things like that, then Turkey is increasingly, more and more, should be becoming European. But of course, at the same time, it's becoming more democratic, it's becoming more Muslim. So Turkey cannot be Europe because it is neither Christian nor secular. That's the way we have defined Europe. In the debate about the European Constitution is, well, what are the values? Well, it is secular Enlightenment values or Christian values in the whole debate. Of course, both, and both are not so separated from one another anyhow. They are really, really related. But the point is that the very difficulty of Europeans to define the origin of their own values, and what do you mean European values? Actually, those values came to Europe somehow also of the Declaration of Human Rights. Certainly it was, again, the tragedies of World War I and World War II that somehow forced these values upon Europe. It was not a long time ago when Germany was debating whether it belongs to Europe, and Europe meant Western Europe, France and Great Britain, or is not really Europe. And of course, the story that Africa begins in the Pyrenees is an old story, right? And whether, any other country belongs in Europe or not. So the question is that it is going to become increasingly more difficult, partly because we went around the world. I come from Spain, and I cannot avoid thinking that we went around the world without asking permission, basically settling everywhere, imposing our will, imposing our language, our religions, and so on. And now, of course, we should not be too careful about not letting other people come into Spain. So it was both, we were conquistadores, and then we were immigrants for a long, long time when Spain became poor. So you have a nation of conquistadores who did not ask for permission to go anywhere, and a nation of immigrants that was grateful to be accepted everywhere. And now for Spain to say we cannot accept immigrants seems to me a rather problematic, certainly on the moral ground, very problematic issue. But talking, if you wish, realistically, the notion that you can completely cross the border is not realistic. What you need is a sensible immigration policy, because actually Europe demographically needs immigrants. The question is, of course, that Europe should have a policy to regulate immigration to receive the kind of immigrants Europe needs, and not particularly all kinds of immigrants. So there is, even from the point of view of a rational policy of immigration, there is no possibility of crossing the borders. The question is how to have a sensible policy. And then, of course, there is the question of globalization. I'm not simply arguing that the nation state is finished. Even in Europe it's not finished, as we see now how issues of national solidarity are becoming, again, central, and resentment of northerners hardworking against lazy southerners. It's, appears, even the Finnish suddenly have recognized their European values and are challenging the values of these southern Europeans. So there is an element in which, of course, the notion of European solidarity is very difficult to achieve. And of course, if European solidarity is very difficult to achieve even among Europeans, to think that we can have solidarity with everybody is, of course, very difficult and not realistic. So this is, of course, the extent to which the difficulty of civic convivencia. That's why convivencia in Spain was not civic, because it did not demand, it did not presuppose common citizenship. But common citizenship presupposes precisely solidarity, sharing cost, wealth, health, education. And it's not only the sharing of liberal values, but it's sharing something. And of course, the more plural, the more religiously, culturally, ethically modern post-secular societies become, the more the question of solidarity becomes an issue. Why should I be solidarious? Even the United States is a much more pluralistic society, but certainly it's a less solidaristic society. It has very little solidarity inside. It has only, American nationalism only works externally against the external enemy. It never works internally to basically integrate the nation. And this is part of the problem. I'm not saying that it's an easy, simply trend. It is a trend that probably is unavoidable. And the question is, how do we, on the one hand, maintain our democratic societies, our liberal societies, while incorporating the religious other. It's not an easy question. I'm not going to simplify the matter. I'm only trying to raise the issue that we will have to face it. And it's better to face it realistically and maintaining also our normative values than rejecting our values. Let me just give you, I'm not trying to pick on Holland, and I have my friend here from Holland. But look, Holland has been one of the most interesting, tolerant, plural societies in Europe. Holland received the Sephardic Jews when they were thrown down from Spain. It received the Puritans that were thrown out of England before they moved on to Massachusetts. They also found refuge in Holland. And also the libertines from the French Enlightenment before the Revolution also found refuge in Holland. So it could give refuge to Puritans, to Jews, to libertines, secularists, but it welcomed the other without expecting the other to become Dutch. And this is interesting. Eventually they became Dutch, of course. And every immigrant becomes a national after 2-3 generations. In this respect, there is the comparative analysis of immigrant integration in this respect shows very clearly. The difficulty is if immigration continues permanently, is open, then of course the impression is that those immigrants are never integrated. This happens with the Hispanics in the United States. Every first generation immigrant, Hispanic immigrant, is monolingual Hispanic. Every second generation is bilingual. Every third generation Hispanic is only monolingual English. And this is happening in Germany also with the Turks. The first generation is monolingual Turkish. The second generation is bilingual. The third generation is monolingual German. This is basically a story that is repeating itself everywhere. But Holland, then came the pillars. Besides the reception of the others, it was itself a plural society because it had the Protestant pillar, the Catholic pillar, and the liberal secular pillar. And then once you have 3 pillars, you could add a 4th Muslim pillar. And this was the attempt. They were attempting to integrate the Muslims through the formation of a 4th Muslim pillar. But then the pillars collapsed. And that society became so homogeneously liberal and tolerant that now cannot tolerate those who are not as tolerant as we are. So we have this very kind of interesting, because the intoleration towards the immigrants did not come in Holland from the xenophobic right, Le Pen and Haider and these people you will expect to be xenophobic, nativist, racist, but actually came from liberal, conservative, gay right activists, precisely about issues of gender equality and gender rights. And of course, I think that we should not confuse being liberal in the sense of accepting liberal principles with actually particular institutionalization of these liberal norms into ethical systems. And we should, if we can tolerate, if we can learn to tolerate precisely all kinds of people that were discriminated against as minorities, certainly gender, sexual minorities, we may learn to tolerate also people that may have different ethical systems, as long, of course, as they follow the law, basically what Habermas called Verfassungspatriotismus. You cannot expect more than that. You cannot make Germans out of them, certainly not by force. They will become Germans, but they cannot be forced to become German. It's something, it just doesn't work this way. So there is a question of how to incorporate liberal principles with democratic principles, and also learn to accept a certain amount of increasingly a reality of religious, cultural, and ethical pluralism. At the global level, it's very clear that this is happening in the sense that we need to learn how to live together all the civilizations and cultures of the world. The notion we had that the whole world is going to become more like Europe, this is the idea we had westernization. I mean, modernization would mean westernization of the entire globe. Today, we know that this is not going to be the case. And we should be ready for the fact that the new superpowers are going to be not Western powers. And therefore, we will have to learn to also tolerate their way of seeing things. It may be difficult for us, but we'll have to learn to live and coexist with one another in the world. And certainly the values that European Western civilization has developed in terms of democracy, in terms of human rights are critical. This is the framework, of course, but the particular institutionalization of these values is going to be very different. The models of equality are going to be very different. Gender equality is going to be very different, even when the same people use the same truths as self-evident, and nobody challenges the truths. Nobody challenges gender equality as a value. Even Muslim women claim that Islam is the perfect religion because it gives them more gender equality than any other religion. Now, of course, you may find this difficult to accept, but the fact that they say it means that they accept the principle of gender equality, only they have a very different conception of what gender equality is. But we could go on into some of the debates transatlantic between America and Europe. We have frequently different conceptions of democracy, different conceptions of liberty and equality, and obviously both are modern, secular, democratic societies, and yet religion plays a very different role in the structure of both societies. I guess with this I should stop and open the floor for discussion.
Thank you very much, and I think, as you suggested, that we should immediately open the floor for discussion. Are there any questions, comments, remarks? Please feel free to ask questions in German as well as in English.
How do you evaluate the future development now? Because you made a very historical schedule of what has been developed. So as we now are confronted with Turkish people and many other nations, how is presentation, socially spoken, as to the integration and all these peripheral elements?
Right. I mean, when I mentioned, and it was part, I wanted to discuss post-secular, what I mean by post-secular. And of course, post-secular, we should go back to the original meaning of secular in Augustine. When Augustine talks of the saeculum, he means this temporal space between now and the parousia, the second coming, in which pagans and Christians have to live together within the same system and also working together towards a common civic good. Of course, this is not what eventually happened with also the Christianization with Christendom as a model, the Papal Revolution and the formation of a Christian society, along with Islam. So you have a parallel process of civilizational. So the question is how to learn. One of the really tasks is for us to become reflexive post-secularists, to become truly secular in the sense of the secular not being not the other of religion, but the secular is this space in which different religions and religion and not religion can live together. And this is the argument of creating public spaces, not precisely create a public space where religion has no role, because then ultimately you are telling not religion. As long as you have churches, because it's the European model, ecclesiastical establishment, you can disestablish churches. You cannot disestablish religious people, because it means disenfranchising them. And when you have precisely Republican religions, this is the model of evangelical religion in the United States, you can tell a Catholic priest not to run for office. But you cannot tell Martin Luther King, a Baptist minister, you have no right to bring your religion into politics. Well, why not? I mean, it's my right as a citizen. Of course, we like it when Martin Luther King does it. We don't like it when Jerry Falwell does it. But the principle is the same. People bringing their religions into public life to debate, to bring their moral issues. So the idea is, of course, immigration, the process of integration is a difficult one. I mean, the American process has been studied better than the European is still relatively recent. And of course, it took a long, long history for America to accept that this was an immigrant society and not only a Christian Protestant society, especially to accept Catholics. immigrant nativism in America lasted for many, many decades, and it was rather nasty against Catholics. So the extent to which even there the process was so difficult to accomplish indicates how difficult it was even in a changing and open society like the United States. So I'm not saying that the task is not difficult. Our whole structure, our whole model of society is based precisely on homogeneous societies. We see plural societies, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, as dysfunctional societies. This is the way in which we are trained. We could also see them, as Obama insists, as actually very functional and very good for globalization. I mean, my point against, for instance, Huntington, in Who Are We? His claim is we should remain WASP, the old Puritan values. Even blacks become WASP for Huntington because they have become American. But Americanization, actually, the great soft power of America, in the same way that the great soft power was to become the first European national society made up of all European nations at the time when the European nations were still fighting with one another. That's why America was involved in European wars, because it was a European nation made up of Europeans. But today it's becoming the first global nation made up of all the people of the world. And this is the great strength of the United States. Of course, it creates a lot of problems of inequality, of precisely insolidarity, and of integration. I'm not selling this as a model. And we should not ever think that there is one model that can be translated and easily brought. The best you can do is trying to perfect, to improve the basically type of society you have, not to bring these ideal normative models. So in this respect, I'm not trying to sell the model of convivencia. I'm only trying to help us think possibilities within our structure, not to radically change our structure. I think this is a utopian fantasy that doesn't go anywhere. Please.
Yeah, even if you don't want to sell it, your civic convivencia, it has to be developed as a concept.
Yeah, of course.
And my question is, does the term of integration fit in your concept to describe the process we are just seeing throughout generations? You talked about 3 generations. Or do we need another term to describe what is going on when we use your concept of civic convivencia? I'm thinking about participation or something like that.
I mean, integration was a model, as a term used before in the model of incorporation of immigrants. Now it's used more incorporation. It's more neutral than integration. But even incorporation is incorporation into a body, right? The question is, does it mean that only the people being incorporated need to change, or does the body need to be changed to incorporate the others? So the question is, of course, it's a foreign body, and the incorporation of foreign body creates antibodies, and it has to create a new structure where the two can live together. The point is, integration has to be a mutual process of reciprocal, somehow, at least interaction. It cannot be a one-way street. And we understood the model in Europe as it is for the immigrants to become like us. But of course, the model only works when we have a very clear idea of who we are. I mean, in Spain is very interesting now because it's the primary immigrant society. When all the other European societies closed their borders, Spain became the immigrant society. And Spain has not developed an Islamophobia, although you will expect there to be more problematic than anywhere else because the history of Al-Andalus, there is an Al-Qaeda in Al-Andalus that claims we are going to reconquer Spain. So you will expect a kind of anti-Islamic, but we, I mean, the Spaniards, cannot become anti-Muslim because we are fighting with one another. So Spain had more victims of Muslim terrorism, the Madrid bombings, than any other European nation. And yet there was no anti-Muslim reaction because it was refracted by Basque terrorists and the problem of the Basque and the Castilians. And the kind of coalition you can find here between the political right, even the xenophobic nativist right, the socialists, the Christian churches, the feminists, the secularists, is impossible in Spain. The feminists are still fighting the Catholic Church, and therefore they rather support the Muslims against the Catholic Church, then join with the Catholic Church to fight against the Muslims. So in the last elections, when the Partido Popular tried to incorporate a very anti-immigrant platform into the election, into the debates, at first the socialists almost fell into the bite, as every other socialist party did in Europe, and also become anti-immigrant. But then Zapatero realized something, and it was a fantastic, genial turn, partly helped by of course, the problem with Aznar and ETA. But the idea is, first, immigrants. Well, Spain is doing fine, thank you. Economically, before the boom collapse, Spain was doing great. So suddenly, you cannot blame the immigrants for economic problems. And there appeared to be no problem of economic integration. Second, we Spaniards, he said, have such a family system that we need people to take care of our children, our parents at home. And the immigrants are doing that. So thanks to the immigrants, we can keep our family system. So he humanized the immigrants. And third, he said, what do you mean to the Partido Popular? They should become like we, like you, never. So it's not that the socialist voter was less xenophobic, but they were more anti-popular than anti-immigrant. So again, my point is of integration is particularly difficult when you have a very homogeneous society that has a very homogeneous idea of itself. The more the society itself is internally plural, the more easier it is to incorporate the other. That's why for America, now the new phase of immigration are much easier because it went through other phases before, and it's post-civil rights integration. It was very difficult for American society to integrate the blacks that had been there for 4 centuries. So it was not a question of immigration here. It's a question of a fundamental definition of who we are and how do we define ourselves. So again, I think that it's a question of integration, yes, but if we understand integration as a process of mutual interaction, mutual recognition ultimately. And of course, it is always the immigrants that change most. They always do. Whether they want to or not, they have to change in order to be able to function in society. It's very little that is demanded usually from the people in the country. But even this little that is demanded sometimes is difficult for people to accept.
Yeah. I have 2 remarks.
Mm-hmm.
The one with regard to Andalusia. The backbone of the process is probably the mysticism of all 3. Because the thinkers you just mentioned were in touch with mysticism. And so it is a question whether this is a factor which should be not neglected.
Yeah.
The second remark is to your concept of convivencia. We had convivencia in history in different parts of this world.
Of course.
But how do you explain the breakdown in Bosnia, for example? They lived together for years and generations, fought in the same armies,
Right.
joined the same norms.
Right. Right.
Broke down.
Right.
Why?
Well, the first question, of course, is I'm glad you made it because indeed they were rationalists and mystics at the same time. And of course, you have a great model today, Abdul Karim Soroush, is of course the great rationalist mystic of Persian, of Shiite, right? And he rejects both the mullahs, the official experts, and political Islam for the sake of both rationalism and mysticism that gives different types of authorities. But at least it shows that irrational religion, mysticism is sometimes understood as irrational religion, can go very well with rationalism. And so it's a very interesting mixture of the two. So I'm glad you made this connection, because at least it opens up the question of what religion is and the different types of religion. But you cannot doubt that they are very strong Aristotelian rationalists as well, and that they defended rationalism. I mean, even Rouge, obviously Averroes was very much defending Aristotle against all those who said that it's incompatible with precisely Islam and so on. And the same, Thomas Aquinas had to do the same thing with Aristotle until it was incorporated into the Catholic Church. Then later it became dogma, but it was difficult to incorporate. The second point, of course, this is the point I made. It is religion which is the problem, or it is national state formation. It is precisely because these ex-communists now want to become the rulers of a new nation state that precisely created the context where this, again, purification of ethno-national identities, and it was because the Croats and the Serbians did it, that then Bosnia, because it was a model that the Croats and the Serbians developed for their states. And of course, it was a model that couldn't work in Bosnia. So Bosnia had to either, so precisely had to be cut up with, so, but it was not, exactly, the point is, it was not religion that was the problem. In fact, Bosnian Muslims were radically secular, and most people in Bosnia were very secular. But it was precisely now political rulers, ex-communists that became now, I mean, both. In the case of Tuchman and Milosevic, both were basically ex-communists that became now nationalist rulers. And they developed the model cuius regio eius religio. Basically, this is what it is, just the transposition of the same old model. Now, of course, the model, the nationalism is the religion, and ethnic nationalism is the ethnic nationalism of the ruler has to become the model for the whole nation. So it's, to a certain extent, my argument would be that it's simply a repetition of the pattern of ethno-religious cleansing that comes with a state formation ever again. But we thought that in Europe we had already overcome this pattern, and the fact that it could come after the dissolution of Yugoslavia. On the other hand, the fact that, I mean, there is a new book, Bloodlands, by Timothy Snyder, a fantastic book about precisely the bloodlands of Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus. The last 200 years has been really a killing fields of all nationalisms, of all ideologies, Nazism and Bolshevism. And yet, these issues, I mean, the way in which Poland has, to a certain extent, not only accepted the borders and not tried to regain parts of Ukraine and Belarus that it lost, but the role it has played in precisely eliminating these issues in the area is a fantastic story. So you have, from the dissolution of communism, two very different stories. One where the lands that had been before communism, really the bloodlands, killing fields of ethno-religious conflict and of ideological conflict, now suddenly the conflicts, these type of issues, have disappeared thanks to a process of rethinking. While in Yugoslavia, it went completely in the opposite direction. A society that had a greater tradition of convivencia than you had in those societies where the ethno-religious killing has been such that there was a purified ethnic communities, right? Jews, Orthodox, Catholics, and Lithuanians, Belarus, Poles, you can have been living together in the same communities, and then the massive killing of each other. And yet this problem, to a certain extent, has disappeared. Not because post-World War II created the borders, but because there has been an attempt to rethink those issues, especially, I would say, on the part of some Polish intellectuals. They play a crucial role in this process.
Yes, please.
After I found out that the convivence was not drinking together, which I thought in my high school days, I became a little bit concerned about the rhetorical structure of how you set up your argument. I do see your criticism of a secular discourse that just blames religion for everything that went wrong in Europe, but I feel a little bit that you're going to the other extreme and almost are becoming apologetic of saying this is not religion to blame, that's politics to blame. And I felt it specifically when you are talking about the glorious times in Spain, when different religions were living together, and you gave other examples like the Shokas Empire and the Mogul Empire, you can talk about the Turkish Empire, but these societies were, first of all, hierarchical.
Yes,
so like
absolutely.
The Leibniz and the Muslim rulers.
That's true.
And I think also things worked well together because people were so strictly separated, and conversions were not like things like, oh, let's convert to more, like you were leaving the old people behind you move to another. So I have a little sense that you're because I think if you start this as a historical background, you have some sense that this might be useful for somehow working out things in Europe. So how do you think about this? Because like the way what you're describing of the glory days in Spain is actually still happening in the Middle East, like where people live in separate communities move to such a model if you think that this is
Right.
this was a more workable model than the secular degeneration that happened afterwards?
No, first, I mean, I tried not to talk of glorious Spain. I mean, very clear that it was not a democratic society. Very clear it was not based on principles of equality, so it was a very hierarchical society. And it was, I said, relatively plural, not pluralistic. And yet, I made the two cases of the process of translation among elites and the relatively massive conversion. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the problem of the old new Christians and the conversions that emerges out after the expulsion. I mean, for 200 years, Spain was fascinated, obsessed with the notion of who among us is a converso, and the whole debate 100 years after. So it had to be relatively usual for it to happen, to become an issue later. So I'm not trying to glorify it, but I'm not saying that it was just purely a plural coexisting societies, the way Furnival has talked of plural colonial societies. And I then say, I put the models of Ashoka and Akbar to argue that, of course, this was a model that was easier on the rulers, where they didn't need to create or produce citizens, but only subjects that they could gather for their expansion. Once you have citizenship, of course, civic convivencia among different groups is much more difficult. So I made this very clear. The difference, and that's why I never call the convivencia in Spain civic convivencia. But the model we have to develop is one of civic convivencia, where you accept difference, but also within a normative structure and a form of democratic, where you have equal citizenship and the fundamental principles of these self-evident truths that we liberal democracies take for granted are respected and protected and accepted by every group. So I do put certain conditions in this respect. So as to the question whether I'm trying to now be too anti-secular and pro-religious, I guess partly is I am a European in America and American in Europe. So I try to, because we Europeans are so take for granted the values of secularism, it is my task. And partly the same thing, I do not have a solution. I'm not proposing that I know the formula that will work. My only task is to force ourselves to think through these issues and to come up with at least some projects. So I'm not presenting this as something that I already have a model and it will work. I don't believe in such a thing as a sociologist, much less as a social actor. So I'm only trying to, if you wish, make us reflect upon these issues. If in the process I've given the impression that I'm glorifying rhetorically, of course, there is certain rhetoric in the contrasting a model that was totally eliminated by ethno-religious cleansing, and to argue that, of course, modern European societies can be understood only as such. Of course not. There's a thing, modern citizenship has, and modern nationalism has tremendous achievements of equality, of liberty, but at a very heavy cost also. The other model had also both advantages and disadvantages. And the system we are going to have to come together, not only for our societies, but for the whole globe. Because for me, the interesting question is not so much Europe. In Europe, I don't see really the problems. The problem is going to be much more at the global level. We better come up with some way of dealing with those issues. As we are entering into a much more global society that will be necessarily plural and diverse at every level. And so the question is how to accept pluralism. So I'm simply trying to raise our consciousness to those issues. I'm not presenting, certainly not Glorious Spain, as a model for the future.
It would be interesting if there's something in the past model, even if you criticize it, that might be useful for the future of Europe.
Well, of course, it's interesting, even the theological arguments they had. Obviously, here you have three universalist monotheist religions, all claiming to be the true religion. They have fascinating, polemical apologetics. Fascinating, all three of them. But even the fact that they got into apologetics, it forced them to at least learn something from each other. And translation, we know that the task of translation is and it was not only translated in one way. If you translate your works into the colonial languages that we Westerners have done very well, the Bible into every language. It's very different from translating also all the other texts, their texts, into our language. And this is something that was done. And not only for the sake of recovering the Greek Roman text, but for the sake also of learning from each other. And there was a real interactive communication between these scholars. I mean, I mentioned these three because obviously they are so eminent, probably some of the most eminent theologians in the three religions, right? And they were precisely lived together, and they influenced very much each other. Well, Thomas didn't influence the others. He was influenced by the others. Yes, please. Yes.
Ja.
Bitte schön, bitte schön.
Ich habe in großem Interesse Ihren Vortrag genossen, als Sie von dem Prozess der Konfessionalisierung sprachen, beziehungsweise der Konfessionalisierung des Staates, der Nation und der einzelnen Individuen, bin ich etwas irritiert gewesen. Können wir das auch so verstehen, dass Sie von einer Verstaatlichung von Religionen ausgehen? Oder sind das zwei unterschiedliche theoretische Ansätze? Das war einer meiner Irritationen. Und der andere, der sich dem anschließt, war, als Sie in Ihrem Vortrag von EU sprachen und von den Grenzen, von den Abschottungen und von der Frage, wer sind wir, wer ist Europa oder wer sind Europäer, und dann von einer sensiblen Politik der Immigration. Das ließ bei mir die Idee aufkommen, gehen Sie immer noch von Nationalstaaten aus, oder wie sind Ihre Überlegungen jenseits Theorien oder Ansätze von Nationalstaaten?
Ja, das ist eine sehr wichtige Frage. It'll be easier for me to answer. I'll be more coherent if I answer it in English. About confessionalization, I studied theology in Innsbruck in 1969, in the early 70s, when every theologian was a secular theologian. God is dead theology, honest to God, the secular city. This is the theology I learned. And even the Catholic Church accepted the thesis as a global telos. Then I came to the United States and I could not understand anything. How can such a modern society be so religious? How can be so secular a society? Because there is no doubt that as even Karl Marx put it on the Jewish question, America is both the land of perfect disestablishment, separation of and the land of religiosity par excellence. So it's both at the same time. The perfect secular state, the perfect secular society, but also the most religious of people. So it forced me to rethink the idea of what we Europeans know the facts. We have become secular, but we have explained secularization through modernization. We say we are so secular because we are so modern. It is this theory that I do not accept. The fact of secularization, yes, but the explanation in terms of modernization, no. We are so secular because we were confessionalized before and we needed to get out of our confessions. So the claim I'm making is that to understand the process of European secularization is better the model of confessionalization and then deconfessionalization than the model of modernization, because the rest of the world, as they modernize, they become more religious. It's only us Europeans that as we modernize became less religious. So it's not a model for the rest of the world. It's a very particular historical development, and my point is linked to confessionalization. Perhaps I am so convinced of this thesis because I see so graphically in Spain. Spain was, again, forced confessionalization under the Franco regime, and everybody was forced to be Catholic again. And after Franco, everybody wanted out of confession, out of religion. And unlike Portugal or Italy, that remain relatively religious Catholic societies, Spain wants to be more secular, more laicist. I will not go to Spain with discussions of the post-secular society. Nobody wants to hear anything about the post-secular. They want to be very, very secular because they could not be secular when the rest of the world was secular. And so I see this as a process of first forced confessionalization and now nachsäkularen Dekonfessionalisierung. And I see Spaniards going to the courts and forcing the Catholic Church to take their names out of the baptismal list because they said, I was forced as a child to be baptized, but I'm not a Christian. Take me out of your list. And the Catholic Church didn't want to do it, so they went to the courts and forced to do it. This, for me, is clearly a symbol of deconfessionalization. This is what thrives. Of course, you cannot read into it, and there are different models. The Scandinavian model is very different from the French. Denmark is both probably one of the most secular societies of Europe, but one of the most confessional still. Only 2% of the population go regularly to church in Denmark, but 80% are members of the Church of Denmark, although most of them are unbelievers and atheists, but they are members of the Church of Denmark. And to be a member of the Church of Denmark and to be a subject, a member of the Danish nation, and to be a citizen of the Danish state is exactly the same thing. And that's why the problem in Denmark is when you are neither secular, nor are Danish, nor are Lutheran. Then you are in trouble. You are the kind of religious minority, which is very difficult. And so I'm not saying there is one single model. The Scandinavian is very different from the pillar societies, from even within Catholic societies. The Italian model is very different from Spain, Portugal very different from France. So I'm not simplifying the story. I know enough of European history to be able to see patterns. But let's look even at the way we have explained secularization as the consequence of modernization. We know that East Germany is still today the most secular society of Europe. Does it mean it's more modern than West Germany, or is so secular because it is so modern? The Czech Republic is the second probably most secular society of Europe. Poland is one of the most religious, both Slavic, ex-communist, relatively equally developed societies. You cannot explain their rates of secularization as simply factors of modernization. Italy and France, two Catholic, modern democratic societies, one of them one of the most secular, the other one of the most religious. You cannot explain their difference in terms of modernization. So the point is, the explanation we have given for our general process of secularization is wrong. The facts are true, and nobody denies the facts. And it's better if we come to try to ask the right questions about how we became secular, rather than thinking, well, we became secular naturally. That's what people do when they become modern, they become secular. No. In Europe, it was like that, but not because we became modern. It's something else, the explanation. So this is why I am insisting on this model of confessionalization, because it offers me a possibility of explaining European secularization better than the old theory, because the old theory doesn't work anywhere else in the world and doesn't work in Europe either. Holland and Switzerland, two biconfessional Calvinist Catholic societies. Again, Holland radically secularized, Switzerland not so. Again, it's simply, we need to ask these questions, and my point is the relation between church, state, nation is a better guide to understand these processes than rates of modernization.
Remains the second question as far as the borders of Europe.
Oh, the borders of Europe, of course. I'm enough of a pan-European, of course. I mean, I'm a Spaniard who studied in Innsbruck. Basically, I'm married to a Ukrainian. Of course, I'm pan-European. I mean, I'm not a national, and I live in the United States. So you could say, for me, Europe is, of course, something natural. I'm a nationalist Spaniard when it comes to sports. I still look at whether any Spaniard won any game or any, but otherwise, my nationalism ends there. And now, how can we develop a European nationalism, a European collective solidarity, a European sense of people, without precisely needing an external enemy? So we need borders to develop an internal identity. My point is that in the modern world, We simply have different ways. We should find different ways of developing common identities and solidarities. National solidarity shouldn't be the only source of solidarity. As we saw from the success of the solidarity movement is that it brought together three very traditions of solidarity: working class solidarity, national solidarity, Catholic solidarity. There are other forms of solidarity. Fortunately, I think we are increasing the model of human solidarity. Transnational, global human solidarity is also increasing. We see it every time. We are more and more emotionally attached to everybody around the world that we were ever. So I think that it will need to be not only post-national in this sense, but also even it will have to be a different model. Nonetheless, there will be plurality. I'm not thinking of a global society made up of one single people. No, we are going to be plural. Precisely because we are going to be plural, we'll have to find ways of doing it without necessarily creating these borders that then, so. And I think that religion is interesting today because it's becoming deterritorialized. It's becoming a transnational dynamic which is not anymore linked to territory. It is the linking of religion and territory and a state, which is ultimately, I would argue, the problem.
I think we have now reached the point where we have to stop here. I thank you once again very much, and I think you gave us a lot of ideas that are worth being thought about and being reflected upon. And so we are looking forward to, first of all, your further publications as well as the development of all the thoughts that you gave to us this evening in order to be developed by ourselves and the common discussion among students and university people and staff in here. Thank you very much. May I just add a word for the members of the Religion und kulturellen Kontext, die Kolleginnen und Kollegen. Der Dekan bittet uns jetzt rüber in C103 mit ihm.
Vielen Dank.